Hello, this is Mike from Urban Legends and Mythologies. I just cracked open a Voodoo Ranger IPA, which means it's time for another episode. On this episode, we are revisiting the land of ice and snow. It seems like half of this series takes place in Russia, but Russia seems to have some of the coolest stories emerge from it. This is the legend, the myth, the man. This is the life story of Ivan the Terrible, widely regarded as the first Czar of all of Russia. So most people who have some kind of fleeting idea of Russian history kind of have a general idea of the myth of Ivan the Terrible and how his story goes. Generally, the story goes that in the 1500s, Ivan was born, and it said that when he was born, lightning actually struck the Kremlin, and it was an ominous omen that this guy would have a tumultuous and crazy life. His father, the Crown Prince of Moscow, dies when he's 3 years old. He grows up in this court with all these kind of feuding people who are acting as like a council. He's largely ignored, and there's all this assassination taking place, and it's a very violent and tumultuous time to grow up in, and this creates a vicious cycle of death which surrounds Ivan's family. However, at 16 he is crowned the Tsar of all of Russia, and he is given absolute power. The problem is that he's so scarred from the emotional trauma of his tumultuous childhood that he's become basically a little psychopath. He would drop animals from the top of the Kremlin and like impale rats and stuff. He was said to have been prone to paranoia, rage, and episodic outbursts of mental instability. He would commit massacres, and he would even murder his own son in a violent rage towards the end of his reign. And the death of this man would lead to the Time of Troubles, which was basically a civil war in Russia at the time for power. That's the general legend and idea that most people hear when they hear about the Tsars of Russia and this particular Tsar. However, the story of this man is really more complex than that little minute-long synopsis. And that synopsis is mostly fueled by propaganda and a misunderstanding of his nickname. Because in fact, this guy was a reformer, and he laid the foundations of the modern Russian state as we know it. So as always, we are going to separate myth from reality. We are going to deep dive into this guy's life, and I am going to tell you the true story of the life of Ivan Vasilievich IV, Russia's first Tsar. And as always, we're going to start right at the beginning. So before we really dive into Ivan's life, we have to understand a little bit about some of the history of Russia up to this point. So in the 1500s, Russia, as the state we know today, didn't actually exist. And the area which would go on to form modern Russia was just a bunch of scattered principalities and microstates and city-states and whatnot. Now, this dynamic resulted as a collapse of the Kievan Rus. The Kievan Rus was actually a state which existed from about the 800s to about the 1200s. And what happened was it really dissolves as a nation state as the Mongol conquests were heading west. And a lot of the principalities and microstates which formed in the aftermath of the dissolution of the Kievan Rus were actually subdued by the Mongols, in this case the Tartars. So the political map is kind of messy at the time. However, out of Muscovy rises a grand prince known as Ivan III. This would be Ivan IV's grandfather, and he's on a mission to kind of make Muscovy, the place that he's a crown prince of, the dominant player in Russian affairs, to which he does. He goes out and he conquers, and he beats back like the remaining Golden Horde, which are the Tatars or whatever they're called. And he starts actually laying the earliest foundations of what would become the Russian state. And Ivan III, he's really the one who first starts calling himself Tsar, not in really an official sense, but in more of a ceremonial sense, because he had actually married the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine XI, Palaiologos. And this actually gave him a connection to the Eastern Roman or Byzantine royal family. And it was upon doing this and taking up the double-headed eagle as the Russian coat of arms and converting to Orthodoxy and declaring Russia and most importantly Moscow to be the third Rome in the wake of the fall of Constantinople by the Ottomans in the 1450s, that he now has this ancient connection to Rome going all the way back to Caesar, and Tsar is is just a Slavic form of the word Caesar. And we see this time and time again. Like I said in that Arthur episode, we see these monarchs, mostly European monarchs, who want to have this like blood connection to Rome, because in their minds and in the minds of the people, that connection is going to solidify that connection with ancient Rome, and they can say that they are a continuation of this ancient culture. And in doing so, it would probably legitimize their rule. So Ivan III and his wife, Sophia Paleologonia, this former Byzantine princess, they go on to have a son named Vasily III, who becomes the father of Ivan IV. Now, Vasily III, his reign was basically a continuation of his father's work. He was solidifying power in the area and making Muscovy the dominant player in the region. And he goes on to marry Ivan's mother, a woman named Alina Glinskaya. And she's the father of the Serbian princess, who's also attached to some nobles based in the Grand Duchy of Lithuania, who all claim descent from Orthodox Hungarian nobles and the Mongol ruler Mami from the 1330s. So there's like this East meets West kind of mixing in the bloodlines, and it's all noble, of course, which all kind of blends together in this unique Russian culture of the time. Everybody always thinks it's the Byzantine Empire where East truly met West, but I think you had to go a little bit more north up towards Russia, because that's where East truly meets West, culturally speaking. So Ivan IV, he's born on the 25th of August of 1530. However, it didn't take Ivan very long to succeed his father. He actually succeeded his father when he was 3 years old, because Vasily III would actually die from complications due to a bleeding ulcer in his leg, which would lead to sepsis, also known as blood poisoning. And, you know, once you get sepsis in the 1500s, there's no cure for that. Hell, even today, it's really hard to combat. I mean, it almost killed me when I was 17, but I digress. So Ivan, the young crown prince of Moscow, he's obviously too young to rule, so he is actually placed under regency, headed by his mother and this council. However, his mother wasn't really popular amongst this group of regents, and it is believed that she was poisoned by one faction within this group only 5 years later. And it was believed that she was killed or poisoned in this coup perpetuated by one of Vasily III's younger brothers, who was a prince who was aiming to become king. These two younger brothers were named Andrei and Yuri, and they felt kind of snubbed when, on his deathbed, Vasily claimed that his son, the young Ivan, would become the crown prince of Moscow, as opposed to these guys. And after this power struggle kind of ensued. Now, the two princes, they were powerful figures in the government, obviously, at the time. However, the regency itself was bouncing back and forth as several of these elite noble families fought for control of the regency. The two dominant families that show up out of this are the Shusky and the Belsky families, who are constantly feuding each other for control of the regency. So it's a very messy time politically, but generally stable. Now, at this time, young Ivan, he's still a kid. I mean, he's only 8 when his mother is assassinated. But being the crown prince of Moscow, he grows up with some of the finest tutors coming out of Western Europe. And he's actually tutored in this really reformist kind of early modern period humanist kind of nature, which is probably why he becomes such a great reformer during his reign. However, it is fair to say that he probably wasn't immune or walled away from any of this trauma or psychological damage which was going on between these two feuding factions who wanted control of the state and his crown. He probably did see his fair share of assassinations and attempted coups and whatnot, and there's no doubt that those tumultuous times would have had a deep psychological impact on him. But it was at the age of 16 when all of this chaos would kind of be quelled for at least a while, because it was on 16 January of 1547 when Ivan was crowned at the Cathedral of the Domitian in the Moscow Kremlin. And unlike all those who came before him, he was not just crowned the crown prince of Moscow, he was crowned the Czar of Russia, the ruler of all of the Russias. Because remember, through his father's and his grandfather's work, this little principality had become the dominant force in all of the Russias, and our young Czar would go on to continue that very work. However, before he does that, 2 weeks after his coronation, he marries his first wife, Anastasia Romanova, who was a member of the Romanov family who would go on to rule Russia for the next 300 years, but we'll get into that in another episode. So by being crowned the Czar of Russia, Ivan Ivan was sending a message to the world and to all the little territories of Russia that his rule was absolute and was not to be questioned. And according to one historian by the name of Janet Martin, the new title, quote, symbolized an assumption of powers equivalent and parallel to those held by former Byzantine Caesars and the Tartar Khan, both known in Russian sources as Czar, end quote. So not only does this title secure the throne, he's intimately tying this title with religion, stating that he's a divine leader appointed by God's will, who will enact God's will on this earth, and attaching his idea to the Orthodox Church, the dominant religion of Russia at the time. He's further solidifying that connection with the Byzantine Empire, particularly Constantinople, because let's remember, at this time, Constantinople has fallen, the Byzantine Empire has fallen, and places like Hagia Sophia are being occupied by the Ottomans. So Moscow effectively becomes the new home of the Orthodox Church, solidifying it as the Third Rome. So by covering the religious base, as long as the cultural base and the historical base, no one can question his legitimacy and his power and his authority. And for the most part, nobody does question it. Now, Ivan, he does kind of take off running. He is a reformer, and in his earliest days, he's with this council and he's creating all these different reforms, and he's kind of dragging Russia, or Muscovy at the time, out of this medieval idea into the early modern period. And for the most part, the early part of his reign is peaceful and filled with these great forward-thinking reforms. In June of 1547, just months after he becomes the Tsar, is the Great Fire of Moscow. Now, nobody actually knows how the Great Fire of 1547 actually started, but we have to remember that Moscow is mostly made of wood, and there's almost 100,000 people in this city at the time. However, this fire starts, it devastates the city, and it even sweeps into the Kremlin and blows up these stores of gunpowder that were there for military purposes. And it's this great disaster. It displaces over 80,000 people, and almost 3,000 people are killed. Now, given the political context of the time, you still had these families kind of fighting and vying for power, and the young Tsar, his position wasn't really solidified yet. So rumors begin that the fire was actually started by the Gliniski family, who were relatives of the Tsar on his mother's side. And these rumors become so widespread that a rebellion begins, and one of the members of the family was actually stoned to death inside the Cathedral of the Mission. And the Tsar's own grandmother on his mother's side was accused of using sorcery to start the fire, and the Gliniski family has to flee from Muscovy into Lithuania, and their power base there kind of collapses. However, in the aftermath of this does strengthen Ivan's position on the throne. He has more support now than ever, and with his coming reforms, he gets even more support. So in the aftermath of all this, while they're rebuilding Moscow, Ivan and his council, they start doing these political reforms, and these are really forward-thinking reforms. For one, they establish a dedicated standing army of professionals. They create the first standing parliament in Russian history. Town and rural communities were given the right to self-management and the distribution of taxes at their own desire. He kind of liquidates the authority of the aristocracy in courts and allows the state to really take over the judicial system. And it also confirmed the right of peasants to leave their feudal lords after a payment of too little taxes or fees, which allowed the peasants to no longer be attached to the lord or the land. They could now travel freely. He also goes on to establish this council to look into matters of the church, because at the same time in the rest of Europe there was a schism happening, the Protestant Reformation. It was leading to war and all this crazy stuff over religion. And these guys in Russia on this council, they were really forward thinking. They were able to already kind of nip that in the bud, because what was happening was Russia had established its own little practices and ideas within the Orthodox Church, which didn't really agree with Greek ideas. So before any violence or craziness could break out like what was happening in the West, they devised a uniform system of regulations and rituals which would basically be the same across all of Russia and kind of embrace all the little local traditions that were going on at the time. This really did solidify the church, and it did quell some possibility of an uprising based on religious grounds over some dumb little ritual or something like that. It defeated the idea of schisms and infighting before it even reached the Orthodox Church. At the same time all this was happening, happening, Ivan was faced with the eternal Russian problem, that being its isolation from sea trade. That's why Russia's greatest desire, the desire of so many czars, and even the desire of their current psycho-dictator today has always been to gain access to warm water ports. And this need for access to sea trade and trade in general would lead to a lot of conquests and wars during his reign. It would also lead to some of Russia's earliest diplomatic ties with England, and this led to a long-standing correspondence with Elizabeth I over trade and military alliances. However, this expansion came with a problem. See, Ivan was in a lot of debt. This was debt that was carried over from his father and grandfather's regimes during their expansion periods. It's basically war debt. And Ivan, he had his own expansionist ideas and his own wars to fight. He fought wars against the Lenovians, the Kazan, and the Astrakhan, who were kind of remnants of the Golden Horde. He was fighting against the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth later on. He would also go on to fight wars against the Turks, and then he would begin what was known as the conquest of Siberia. So he was constantly on the warpath from the very beginning of his reign. Now, I'm not going to focus too much on all his wars and conquests because they did go from like before the beginning of his reign all the way beyond the end of his reign. However, we got to remember that these constant wars and this constant expansion was kind of looming over him and was the reason why he would go on to perform some of the actions that he did. Now, as we said, Ivan's reign on the home front at least was peaceful for the most part for the first 10 years of his marriage, and this is really attributed to his wife, Anastasia. It was said that she was the one who was really able to temper his anger and his paranoia and his distrust of the boyars, which I haven't really gotten into yet, but the boyars are basically the name for the aristocrats who are always manipulating and vying for power for their own little families or whatever. And a lot of people believe that it was not only the influence of his tutors growing up, but the influence of his wife, which really set him on this reformist course. However, Ivan was never without his brutality and his distrust of the boyars. In fact, in 1553, Ivan suffered near fatal illness, and he believed that he was not going to recover. So while he was laying there on what he thought was his deathbed, he called the patriarchs of the aristocratic families there, the boyars, to swear an oath of allegiance to his eldest son, who was an infant. However, many of them refused since they deemed the Tsar's health too hopeless for him to survive. And this pisses off Ivan to no end, and after he recovers, they meet swift and brutal reprisals, including assassinations, confiscations of property, and anything you could do to like really quash these insolent little bastards. And it further rooted his distrust and this deep seething hatred for these boyars, the aristocratic class, because let's remember, these are the same class of people and a lot of the same families who were vying and scheming for power during his regency, and they had committed their own atrocities such as assassinations of his own family members, so it's no wonder why he had no trust in this class of people. Now, that illness happened shortly after the Great Siege of Kazan, so for context, this had been part of this lingering war with the Tartars, and he was basically fighting for control of the Volga River, which would be a great trade route. And essentially, he leads his army to Kazan, which is kind of the Tartar capital. He seizes it, and it's a great victory. The city was razed, the people were massacred, anybody of Russian descent who were slaves of these people were freed, and St. Basil's Cathedral was actually built to commemorate that battle, that win, that victory. And St. Basil's Cathedral is that iconic Russian cathedral we see today. It's actually 9 different churches, and it's a mixture of Roman architecture and Byzantine architecture and Russia's own flair with those onion domes, and it still stands as an iconic symbol of Russia today. I mean, when you think of Russia, that is the very first thing you think of other than freezing cold winters. And Ivan, he imported builders from all over Europe to build this cathedral, and second only to Hagia Sophia, it's one of the most beautiful churches in Christendom. And I'm sure along with the Russo-Kazan War and his other wars, it cost the taxpayers a pretty penny. Also in 1553, Ivan gets the great idea to introduce the first printing press in Moscow. And we all know about the printing press. The printing press is absolutely revolutionary, and it was here in Moscow as well. However, it kind of pissed off a bunch of the local scribes, you know, like the monks or whatever who sit in the churches just handwriting these books all day because they saw it as destroying their practice. And they actually burned the Moscow print yard down at one point, causing the owners of it to flee to Lithuania. However, the good times didn't last forever, and it was after about 1560 when we start to see a reversal in all of this and a change for the worst. So for context, Ivan is still enamored in a series of costly wars. He's trying to secure trade routes, mostly, and he's doing these ambitious building projects. Well, the thing is, all of this is costing money, and the kingdom is basically bankrupt. And by 1560, everything comes to a head. See, he's in a war against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and the Swedes, as well as dealing with Tartar invasions in like the east. And there's like this Swedish blockade going on, which is blocking his trade with England and the rest of Europe. And on top of that, there is a devastating famine that comes as a result of a drought. And the worst part of it is his wife in 1560 dies, and it was suspected that she was poisoned. Now this crushes Ivan, and it's said that right then and there, his personality completely changed, and it would change for the rest of his life. So at this point, it looks like all is lost. His wars are going badly. He has people, even princes, who are defecting to the enemy and devastating regions of Russia. And at the same time, he's losing clout with the people because the taxes have been raised so much that they can no longer afford them. And he ends up becoming so paranoid of his own nobility and suspicious of them that on December 3rd, 1564, he leaves Moscow and abdicates the throne. He basically says, "I'm done. You can all destroy yourselves for all I care." So Ivan leaves Moscow and he heads for Alexandrova Sloboda, a little like duchy or principality or whatever that Ivan still has like full control over. And he sends 2 letters to announce his abdication, and the causes for his abdication are because the embezzlement and treason of the aristocracy and the clergy has led to basically the chaotic destruction of the country. And at this point, everything blows up in the face of the aristocracy. So the boyars, they're completely unable to rule without Ivan, and the Muscovite citizens are pissed. They're on the verge of rebellion. So the boyars actually send an envoy to literally beg Ivan to return to the throne. And Ivan does return, however, on one condition. It is that he be granted absolute power to do whatever he needs to do in order to regain control. And in their desperation, the boyars agree. So Ivan returns and he immediately starts executing these new powers. For one, he starts condemning and executing traitors and confiscating their estates without the interference of the boyars or the churches. And the definition of a traitor was just literally anyone whom Ivan decreed to be a traitor. And these persecutions targeted primarily the princely clans of Russia, notably the influential families of Suzdal. He executed, exiled, or forcibly tonsured prominent members of the boyar clans on questionable accusations of conspiracy, and he effectively crushes any and all opposition to his absolute rule over Russia. And he's able to do this with help of a personal guard that he creates called the Oprichniki, who literally owed their status and allegiance to Ivan and Ivan alone, and he would go on to reward them greatly for their loyalty. And these men, along with others, would go on to form the Oprichnina. And the whole point of this is to wipe out this old aristocracy and to replace it with a new guard. And this new guard would have allegiance only to Ivan and Ivan alone. So there's this massive wave of repression and all of those great reforms which took place during the beginning of his reign, they're all reversed. And this really affected the peasant class hard, and it went on to basically crash the economy, because with these new members of the Oprichniki being the new aristocracy and ruling over these lands in the state, they had nobody acting as a check on their power and authority, so they were not held accountable for their actions, so they take advantage of this. And the first thing they do is they start brutally oppressing their peasants, mostly in the form of taxes. They increase the taxes on the peasant class tenfold. This results in a lot of peasants just fleeing their lands for better places, which caused a crash in overall grain production, which was already at a low because of this drought and famine, and the price of grain actually shot up tenfold. And it gets even worse. So by 1570, an epidemic, which is probably a plague, probably similar to the bubonic plague, sweeps through Novgorod and Moscow, and it is said to be killing up to 600 to 1,000 people daily in Moscow. It kills over 10,000 people in Novgorod alone. And it's made even worse with this famine that is still going on, and these rising grain prices and these insanely high taxes. Another war that Russia has become entangled in. And at the time, Ivan is suspicious that the wealthy leaders of the city of Novgorod are going to defect and place the city under control of Lithuania. And this suspicion is exacerbated when a Novgorod citizen by the name of Pyotr Volinets warned the Czar that there was a conspiracy that was taking place to do exactly this. So in response to this, Ivan orders the Oprichniki to raid the city, and they burn and pillage Novgorod and the surrounding villages, and the city never regained its prominence after that. This was the sack of Novgorod, and it was considered to be just a bloody massacre. And to be honest, there was no real evidence presented to Ivan that this conspiracy was actually taking place. He just took the word of some random guy, and this was a very bloody siege. It lasted 5 weeks, and every day 500 to 600 people were killed. And they killed almost everybody. They killed men, women, children. They even hunted down the local archbishop like a dog and killed him where he stood. And even on the orders of Ivan, men, women, and children would be tied to sleighs and pushed into the freezing Volkhov River and died of drowning, which, to be honest, sounds like a brutal way to die. So at this point with Ivan, the impulsivity's ramped up to 10, the paranoia is ramped up to 10, and the general hatred is ramped up to 10. However, the Oprichnina and the Oprichniki didn't really last much longer after the sack of Novgorod, because during the Russo-Crimean War of 1572, the Oprichniki failed to prove themselves against a regular army. They were horribly defeated. And since they failed to prove themselves worthy against this regular standing army, Ivan loses all faith in them, and he abolishes the Oprichniki, which a lot of people believe, and I personally believe, that was an impulsive decision. So after this, probably another impulsive decision, in September or October of 1575, Ivan appoints a man by the name of Simeon Bekbulatovich to be the Grand Prince of all of Russia. Now, Simeon, he reigns for about a year as a figurehead, but he's obviously under Ivan's command because he does everything Ivan tells him to, and he's acting on Ivan's instructions to confiscate all the lands that belong to the monasteries, and Ivan came out in public and pretended to disagree with this decision. You know, he pretended like he sided with the churches and whatnot. So the next year, Simeon, he steps down as Grand Prince of all Russia and returns Ivan to the throne. And when Ivan returns to the throne, he's like, oh, I'm a great friend of the churches, and he gives back some of the land to the monasteries, keeping the rest for himself. Now, obviously, any idiot can see that this was just a scheme so Ivan can confiscate these lands while placing the blame on someone else, and his little scheme worked. He ended up with the lands with none of the blame, but when you look at it through a historical context, anybody can easily see what he was doing. Now, why he wanted these lands, it's anybody's guess. I think it was just so he can show more dominance over the Russian state while taking away a little bit of the church's power. But that is just a little interesting side note in his story. However, it seemed like Ivan can never take a break because he was still at war with mostly the Polish, the Lithuanians, the Swedes, and the Tartars. They were raiding his territories even long after he died, as well as he also spent a large amount of time in his later reign trying to push his armies deeper into Siberia. And while some of his wars were successful, others weren't successful, but it's said by the time he dies, the empire, Russia, had doubled in size. However, at this time, the economy economy was completely destroyed, and this would lead to the time of troubles, which would come up after his death. However, there is one other major factor which played a role in creating the time of troubles and probably could have been prevented if this man had been allowed to live, and this man was his son, Ivan Ivanovich. Now, in 1580, Ivan Ivanovich, he marries a woman named Yelena Sheremeteva. So she was from this noble family, and she was actually the third wife of the young Ivan Ivanovich because his first two wives had been sent away to a monastery by Ivan for being unable to bear children. Now, as the story goes, in October of 1581, Yelena was found to be pregnant. However, on November 15th, the Tsar accused her and berated her for supposedly wearing immodest clothing at like a dinner function, and he proceeded to beat her in such a violent fashion that she actually miscarried the child shortly after this beating. And the younger Ivan, he wasn't going to take that, so he grabs his father, he pulls him off of her, and he screams at her. He says, "You sent my first wife to a convent for no reason. You did the same with my second, and now you strike my third, causing the death of my son in her womb." And this starts a heated argument where he confronts his father on the matter, and in a rage, Ivan, he takes his staff. He has this big staff, this big heavy staff with this point on it, and he cracks the younger Ivan in the head with it, effectively bashing his skull in, and the younger Ivan would die of his wound on 19 November 1581. Now, Ivan, when he does this, he immediately regrets it because it's in this fit of rage, this uncontrollable rage that he seemed to constantly struggle with throughout his life. It was said that he clutched his young son in his arms and began to wail like a maniac in response to this action that he had done, but he had killed his heir. Now, while Ivan did have a second son, and that son would actually go on to be Fyodor I of Russia, he was considered weak-minded and a good churchly figure who had little to no interest in politics. A lot of people believe that he possibly had an intellectual disability or a learning disability. In fact, his main focus in life was the church. And Ivan, despite having up to 6 wives and 9 different children, Fyodor was really the only one who could succeed him at this point, and he just had to accept that fact. Now, unfortunately, Fyodor would later die childless at the end of the 16th century, and then this ushered in the time of troubles, which his father Ivan probably bears most of the blame for, and rightly so. It is believed that if the younger Ivan had lived and had children and continued on the line, the Rurik dynasty would have probably lasted for much longer, and the state of Russia would have looked much different than it does today. However, that timeline would not come to pass, and on March 28, 1584, Ivan IV dies from a stroke while he was playing chess, thus ending a very tumultuous, insane reign, which was dominated by war, strife, famine, and just for a glimpse at the very beginning, we could have seen the foundations of a very liberal modern state take place. However, history and the political and economic atmospheres of the time just did not allow that to happen. So what can we say about Ivan IV Grozny? Was he really Ivan the Terrible? Some camps say yes, some camps say no. We have to understand that this is a very complex individual who was thrown into a very complex situation. From his very birth, he is the inheritor of a growing, burgeoning empire, which is already saddled with war and debt and all these complex issues. He's a child thrown into a situation where assassination is around every corner, and before you know it, there's a knife in your back. His own mother was assassinated when he was a child, and he was orphaned at the age of 8, and the aristocracy basically just used him as a pawn for more political power. So it makes sense that throughout his reign, he would dedicate his reign to bringing these people down who basically made his childhood a living hell. And it seems like he spent his whole lifetime trying to just hang on to and consolidate his power, because it was never really stable in the first place. You had all these outside influences coming in and throwing everything into chaos. Now, we do see that when he's a young man, he does really believe in these reforms, and it does seem that he does take a genuine interest in the interest of his people and creating a modern state, and he wants to keep expanding that state so he can secure his borders against his enemies, which is something that Russia has always done. He wants to give this new state the best chance it has, but due to corruption in the aristocracy, he is forced to literally abandon it until they beg him to come back. And it's obvious that in his mind, he blames the aristocracy for the problems of his state, so when he does decide to come back, he comes back with a plan and a vengeance, and that's when everything turns dark. And then you throw in these outside influences of more corruption and famine and drought and the collapse of the economy and constant, costly, non-ending wars that never seem to let up. It all creates a recipe which leads to a disaster, especially for this guy mentally. So it's no surprise that he lived his life in paranoia, unable to control his emotions, unable to control his rage, and unable to control his own ambition. And hell, I think that if any one of us were put in that same situation, we probably wouldn't have acted too differently. Now, a lot of people will take his name, the Terrible, and look at the massacre of Novgorod, the treason trials he held, the brutal reversal of peasants' rights, his virtual liquidation of the whole aristocracy, and the murder of his own son. And a lot of us will think, well, that makes sense. He was Ivan the Terrible. He was a brutal tyrant. However, that's not what the moniker really means. It's a myth. The idea terrible is associated with all this stuff is a myth. The moniker actually comes from Ivan's nickname Grozny, and it was mistranslated into English as being evil, tyrannical, terrible, blah blah blah. However, when you look at the term Grozny in the contemporary use that it was being used at the time, it means courageous, magnificent, magisterial, keeping enemies in fear, and keeping the people obedient. It was actually a very proud title and not the slur that it has become today. Now, like I said, he was a very complex character, and was he deserving of any version of that word? No. I think it was somewhere in the middle. But when you look at any character who has a near mythical status about them, and we see it with a lot of historical figures, particularly kings who have a legend associated with them, or some kind of urban myth or whatever associated with them, a grandiose story, that the truth always lies somewhere in the middle. Did he commit horrific deeds? Yes. But did he also commit great deeds? Yes. But at the end of the day, regardless of whether or not he did evil deeds or great deeds, he did these deeds in service to his people and his country. Now, you can argue in service to himself as well. However, Russia would not be Russia today if it was not for the life and the actions of Ivan IV Vasilievich Grozny, Russia's first Czar. And on that note, I think that's where I'm going to end it for today. Once again, this is Mike with Urban Legends and Mythology, and if you like the show, all I ask is that you tell a friend, like, subscribe, follow it, whatever. All of that stuff really does help the show out and allows it to grow. Now, I gotta admit, when I first went into this story, I didn't think there was gonna be a lot there, so I basically just had to look up a biography of this man's life, and it was pretty epic. And I know this is like the third episode in a row where it's basically a biography of someone's life who's an actual real figure but has made his way into legend, but that's what we do here. We separate the legend from the mythology in order to get to the truth of whatever the topic is. And as always, this was a very highly requested, fan-requested episode. However, I will say that in this particular episode, I really expected to deep dive into more myth and legends surrounding the man himself, except the fact is there's not really a lot of that. A lot of the myth and legend is actually true, so I guess it just turned out to be a biography of this man, which, hey, I'm okay with that. However, this is like the third one in a row I've done, and in the next few weeks I'm gonna kind of get away from these. I'm gonna go back into some myths and legends which deal with cultures or cryptids or whatever. So be sure to check out those episodes and some of the legacy episodes, and I'll see you there.